I had the opportunity to present to another chapter of FANG, I guess about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And based upon the success of that event, I was invited to this. So I appreciate that and hope this is the start of something regular with you guys. Our company really is in the business of helping businesses make crucial decisions in Latin America, in their Latin American operations. And those decisions are usually related to growing their business, protecting their business, or measuring their business. And I myself do a lot of, I get involved a lot in the planning, the annual as well as strategic planning of our clients. And part of that is providing presentations like this, bespoke presentations centered around the industry, around the company in question, but also leaning upon the sort of macroeconomic political trends that I'll be presenting today. As you can imagine, since recent political changes and the general sense of unease and uncertainty that has come with that and certain pronouncements, these kind of presentations have been in much demand of late. I really wanted to, I put this presentation together. It's a combination of things. It really has three components. One is to really understand the emphasis on China, not only in a bilateral sense between the US and China, but in almost all of US foreign relations messaging and goal setting is now very much conducted through the prism of a China containment strategy. And there's good reason for this. We can question perhaps the tactics being used, but there's no question that China has grown to be a very effective rival of the United States, including and perhaps most especially in Latin America. And to trace sort of Chinese involvement in Latin America, you have to go back to actually a white paper that was published in Beijing in about 97 by a think tank there. I've forgotten their name, but essentially the white paper said, it's okay if we begin doing business in Latin America. It's not going to upset the Americans. Their focus is elsewhere. And that really that was the green light to the first organizations, the first companies to look at Latin America and begin engaging were mostly state-owned enterprises. And the first wave of those investments really were around acquiring natural resource assets. China faced the same dilemma that Japan faced in the 70s and Korea faced in the 80s. Their industrialization, their manufacturing focus, their export manufacturing goals could not be met unless they could secure natural resources at a reasonable price. For the Japanese and Koreans, that meant going out to countries with somewhat dubious risk profiles like Sudan or Algeria or Iraq, and signing long-term service contracts, 25-year, 30-year supply contracts at very competitive prices. And that was the key to their energy security, their natural resource security that allowed them to continue their export manufacturing strategy. By the time China got around to that, the price of natural resources was higher, in part because China was a much bigger player. And so their fast growth in manufacturing, as well as their big investments in infrastructure at home, were actually price movers on the global commodities market. So it didn't make sense to lock in long-term pricing, given the high prices that there were. So the smarter play was to go out and buy these assets. They also had about $2 trillion of dollar reserves. They had a fixed currency that was artificially undervalued and generating all kinds of dollar surpluses every year, and they needed to take some pressure off of that. So using those dollars to go out and buy assets was a double win for them. Eventually, if you recall in 2007 with the financial crises, what's not perhaps covered that much in US media or even Western media in general was just how devastating it was to China. China relied on trade finance for its export industries And these industries operated on very tight margins. And working capital at the time was still pretty scarce in China. So when trade finance dried up in 2008 during the financial crises, the export sector in China was deeply, deeply impacted. Millions were put out of work. And so China began this sort of Keynesian construction project to build subway systems and road systems and public housing, and went a little overboard, frankly. If you go to China, second-tier cities, you'll see near-empty metros and near-empty roads. Um, and eventually, but in the process of this Keynesian project, they built the biggest engineering and construction industry in the world by far, by manyfold. And when they ran out of projects in China, they realized they needed more projects to keep these people employed because nothing scares Chinese leadership more than unemployment. And so they created the Belt and Road strategy, which is, some people see as their strategy to take over the world, but it really is about keeping construction workers employed. And it started in near China, in Southeast Asia, and near Asia, but eventually went to Africa and Latin America. And this is the really the emphasis of Chinese investment in infrastructure. The other part of the infrastructure strategy was to support the efficient movement of commodities out of mines and farm fields and oil and gas reserves in Latin America and efficiently move them to China. So that meant investing in ports, in rail lines, in road lines, et cetera. And eventually, China sort of evolved from a maquiladora economy to one where they have their own brands, including 50 different car companies, about 150 car brands. And these products were challenged to sell into wealthy markets. So they focus on middle income markets, and Latin America is the largest middle income market in the world. So today you'll see Chinese brands are the top selling nationality of cars in Peru, in Chile, in Ecuador. Even here in Mexico, as close as it is to the US, 20% of new car sales are Chinese brands. There's over 50 Chinese brands here in Mexico. And the fourth wave has been mostly led by Chinese private companies, and that's in the digital, so e-commerce, digital goods, digital services, and also tourism. So a little bit about the background and the waves and the logic behind the movement of Chinese investment in Latin America over the last 25 years. When it comes to trade, China is winning. China is a much more complementary economy to Latin America versus the United States. The US competes very openly with Brazil in soy, with Argentina in wheat, in horticulture with Mexico, Peru, Chile. So there's not as much trade potential there. China, of course, imports all these products and is a net importer of all these products, not a net exporter of agriculture the way the US is. And as a result, it's a much less frictionless trade environment. And China as a customer is now the largest customer of almost every South American country. Now, why has the US suddenly become, or it appears suddenly, sort of anti-China in its foreign policy? Well, there's three pillars of US foreign policy, if you think about it. One is the political. And most elected representatives in the US, and frankly, most countries, don't necessarily have a full understanding of all of the minutia of foreign policy of the countries with which we're trading and cross-investing. So they rely on think tanks to inform their votes, to inform their thinking. And whether they're Republican influencing think tanks or Democrat influencing think tanks, those think tanks have been calling alarm bells about the rise of China for over 15 years now. The other pillar is military, and similarly, the US military has been ringing alarm bells about not just a rapidly expanding Chinese Navy, but also the fact that China is building naval bases around the world. China has, for instance, in Argentina, built a space satellite infrastructure that could monitor what is the next sort of frontier of military conflict, i.e. space, and as well as the ability to surveil through satellites. But it was the third pillar, the U.S. corporate sector, that held back, that did not want to antagonize the Chinese, that instructed through their lobbying efforts their representatives in Washington to go easy on China. Why? They were hopeful they would penetrate the Chinese market. After all, it's the second largest market in the world. For certain products, like cars, it's the biggest. But one after the other, they failed to penetrate the Chinese market. They either faced very stiff local competition, some dubious regulatory hurdles, and they realized one after the other that they were never going to make much inroad in China. The outsourcing to China became less and less competitive over time because as of 2008, the manufacturing labor pool in China began to shrink. So the cost of labor has risen about 10% a year for the last 12, 13 years. The variable cost of labor in China now is higher than Mexico. And so China was eventually deemed by the US corporate sector as more of a threat than an opportunity. A threat because the Chinese were now making big inroads in emerging markets where American brands had been dominant. And so now, or as of actually about 2018, you saw a coming together of both political parties in Washington and the corporate sector raising alarm bells about China and beginning to put tariffs on Chinese products, which the Biden administration maintained, putting quotas on certain products, et cetera. Now, behind a lot of the concerns the U.S. have in Latin America and the way they're trying to reshape bilateral relationships in Latin America is this anti-China strategy. In Panama, of course, they were quite open about it. They were concerned about Chinese ownership of the ports, one on either side of the canal. They're concerned about the increase in Chinese ownership of logistics companies that work near the canal. And the canal is important because should China go to war with Taiwan, half of the U.S. naval assets are in the Atlantic Ocean, and they wouldn't be able to quickly get to the Pacific theater of war if the canal was compromised. In Brazil, Peru, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, there's concern about Chinese ownership of critical minerals. There's concern about Chinese ownership of certain infrastructure like ports, the port of Shanghai, for instance, in Peru. The ability now through that port and through roads being built into Brazil to essentially move natural resources without going through the canal. A lot of not necessarily aggressive tactics. It's actually protecting China against being contained by the Americans. But that is perceived as a threat to the Americans. So you don't hear a lot about it, but there's a lot of concern in Mexico that Chinese companies have come in under the guise of complying with the USMCA and adding value in Mexico to make their products eligible to sell into the US market. There's some dubious accounting there, and that is certainly an area of contention. And I think you'll see more and more pressure on the Sheinbaum administration to properly audit those companies. As you move further south, the ability of the US to gain leverage and change any domestic policies, any level of engagement between Latin American countries and China begins to diminish. So as you can see in blue there, those are countries where the US is the predominant economic partner. But as you move into South America, the countries in pink red, the Chinese have huge influence, is either the largest trading partner and or one of the largest foreign direct investors, and certainly as the largest leading bilateral lender. Now, how will China change course in Latin America? We've already seen the CELAC get together and lots of pronouncements made. One of the most important and substantial moves that has happened since the US and China began this trade war more robustly 3 months ago, is that China, who has traditionally been a huge buyer of American soy, wheat, chicken, beef, and other agricultural goods, essentially canceled about 90% of those contracts and have turned to Brazil and to some degree Argentina to replace that US supply. And in fact, have committed about $12 billion in investment in infrastructure inside Brazil and Argentina to widen the export capacity so that those products can move more easily, more cheaply, and faster to China. We're seeing the Chinese very interested in essentially filling any gap left by US DOGE decisions to defund multilateral organizations. We will see a stepping up of the Chinese in terms of aid financing to replace the decline of USAID. We're seeing just a more respectful, I would say, engagement by the Chinese and more recognition of Latin American heads of states inside these multilaterals where China has important sway, such as BRICS. We are seeing more and more cultural and educational ties. The Chinese now, what they do is much like I forgot the name of the program, but the famous program in the US where they would provide scholarships to the best and brightest from around the world.
The Fulbright scholarship.
Thank you, the Fulbright. Thank you. So the Chinese have something similar. They are fostering the next generation of the elite in Latin America, making them comfortable with China, bringing them over, giving them tours, giving them a very luxurious stay, subsidizing master's degree or doctorate level education. They're doing the exact same playbook. So as the US retreats, the Chinese step in. What can we expect in terms of trade relations with Latin America? First of all, the strategic goals behind the threat of tariffs are now fairly well known. One, of course, is to reindustrialize the US by repatriating manufacturing back to the US. That is a very difficult goal to achieve. More realistic is that new investments will be recalibrated with less labor-intensive models, more automation, and new manufacturing capacity will be built in the States. But moving existing factories is a very costly endeavor because ultimately they're interwoven supply chains. The average car in North America crosses the border 18 times on its way to being fully assembled between Canada, the US, and Mexico. So it's a very difficult thing to untangle. Market access, this is where I think one of the greatest justifications for playing hardball with countries around the world is the fact that the US, entering the US, not in terms of tariffs, but in non-tariff barriers, the US is a much easier market to enter than many markets around the world. Now, what we saw on Liberation Day on April 2nd, even though we were promised that they would take that into account, it was not taken into account. It was a very simple calculation based upon trade balance and had very little to do with these non-tariff barriers. But this is really where work ought to be done to simplify trade patterns and make it easier for US companies to, or anyone, frankly, to enter these markets. The ability to isolate China, I think, will be very difficult for the reasons I just cited. Raising revenue, yes, tariffs will raise revenue, but depending upon who you're talking to, we're looking at anywhere from 10 to 30% of coverage of the tax cuts that are being proposed. So yes, it will raise revenue. No, it will not match the tax cuts. And just as a weapon of diplomacy, a very bludgeon-like weapon, we saw that at work, for instance, in Colombia. We're seeing it at work elsewhere. This tends to have varied results. In a small country, highly reliant on the US, like Colombia, it can move mountains. And in a country like Japan, less reliant on the US, at least in terms of economics. Certainly, military security, they're very reliant, but it's less effective. Okay, what does the market think? Well, the market is concerned. The market sees tariffs as well as the anti-immigration movement as highly inflationary, and we're seeing inflation tick up. I'm sorry, this data is a month old, but you can see the trends, and growth is going down. And these are unusual pairings. Usually they move together. As growth goes down, inflation goes down, and vice versa. So this is stagflation, and we haven't had stagflation in the U.S. John Welsh will correct me, but I think since the 1970s. So this is a worrisome trend. And as you can see in terms of how the administration did in the first 100 days as measured by the S&P, this is the worst presidency since the Second World War. So this is important stuff because clearly there isn't any sort of obvious political obstacles to Trump's policies, given that the Republicans control both houses. But this does weigh on voters and does weigh on those representatives. What do we think is going to happen with the USMCA? I think the two most likely scenarios are, number one, it does get renegotiated, and essentially any changes will be window dressing. Why do I say that? There are some significant changes that ought to be made. One is opening up energy in Mexico. Another in Canada would be access to Canadian retail banking, access to Canadian fresh water, and removing limits on U.S. ownership of certain strategic industries in Mexico, like the railways. Mexico might cede on the railways. The railways could do with more capital. I don't think they'll cede on energy. That's just too sensitive an issue. And frankly, the Canadians are in no political mindset right now to cede anything. And the Canadians, much more than the Mexicans, are willing to walk away from the USMCA. I'm not saying that's their preferred option, but right now the politics in Canada are pretty united against standing tall against the Americans. It may be naive and it may really hurt them in the long run, but that's where the politics are today. In Mexico, it's much less of it's really not on the minds of Mexican voters. A much bigger issue to Mexicans is what's going on in Mexico with the Sheinbaum administration. As we look around the region, we see politically that the region, after experimenting with sort of left-wing populism that was the direct result of some pretty awful COVID policies that were incredibly restrictive to people's movements and to business, that created massive unemployment, and basically in 9 months of COVID quarantines, Latin America backtracked on 20 years of progress of diminishing income distribution gaps because it was the poor who were impacted. You had middle-class bureaucrats telling people to stay home when 60% of Latin Americans work in the informal market. So you basically got a government official telling 60% of the population, tomorrow your income goes from 100 to 0, and we're not going to let you know when that's going to change. So as a result, the entire region kicked out the incumbent political parties, most of which were center-right, and elected left-wing populists. What we discovered in 22, 23, 24 was the institutions in most of these countries actually held up pretty well. Petro was contained in Colombia. Boric was contained in Chile. Boluarte was contained in Peru. Lula was mostly contained in Brazil. And Argentina eventually moved right to Milei. And so what you see in Latin America today politically is the success of the Milei administration will have even greater influence, and that is no more government waste. The idea of wasting money in the name of helping the poor is an argument that is losing credibility in most Latin American countries, and people want less waste, They want more jobs. They want better paying jobs. And we're seeing politics moving towards a much more business-friendly environment as a result. An interesting impact of trade flows. You've got, of course, the U.S. tariffs. You have as well this trade conflict between the U.S. and Chinese that has created massive opportunities in Brazil and Argentina. You have Mercosur finally finding political unity by virtue of the fact that they still feel, the European companies may get locked out of the U.S. market due to tariffs. And the same could happen to Brazilian exports. And so the divisions, first of all, they restructured the negotiating so they don't have to have unanimous approval of Mercosur. They broke it into phases. And as a result, it is much more likely to move forward starting very soon. And that's going to open up opportunities. And you're seeing also, as part of the tariffs on Chinese goods, you're seeing more and more products being, you're seeing more nearshoring moving to Central America and even Colombia to pick up the slack in terms of Chinese product being kept out of the U.S. market. When we look at the region, we look at Latin America vis-a-vis other parts of the world. What's interesting here is, and this is a busy graph, but if you look at the blue lines, that was the 10-year average from 2009 and 2019. Those were the last 10 years before COVID. And as you can see, Latin America versus the world was about half the growth rate of the world in that decade. Well, now, if we look at 2005, the growth of Latin America is higher than the world average. So Latin America's growth has increased, but also global growth and the big drivers of global growth like China have slowed. So we're seeing Latin America as a more captivating market. And certainly for financial investors, they see Latin America as an interesting place because of its natural resource endowment, 600 million consumers, demographics that are still favorable to spending, et cetera. When you look at the average growth, and this is the average growth over the next 2 years, 2005, 2026, you do see big differences. Argentina will lead the region and Mexico will be the laggard. And in fact, Mexico this year in 2025 will probably be zero or even negative growth. You are still seeing foreign direct investment increasing in Brazil and Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Peru, et cetera. Only in Mexico is it going to decrease this year. And the reason is, I'll get into Mexico in a sec, but it's a combination of the trade disputes with the US and also the first year of a sexenio. And that's where we find ourselves here in Mexico. The moneyed class in Mexico, the investor class, the grupos industriales, as they call them here, they traditionally were very hesitant to invest in the first year of any new six-year political cycle in Mexico. Why? Because each president has a very different vision of the market. They may be from the same party, but that doesn't guarantee continuity. And whatever their sort of pet project is, wherever they want to point government dollars in terms of capital investment, that can have a big impact on where opportunities lie. And so these groups tend to wait. They sit on their money for a year and they will wait and see. Go in the past was that roughly half of its economy is tied to the exports, mostly to the US. And the investments that build the side of the economy tended to do just fine and did tend to continue. But of course, this year is different. There's a disruptive election in the United States trade policies, but also we have a coinciding election in Mexico. Leaders getting to know each other. The relationship is not as rosy as people think. I was in on a conversation yesterday where, Trump chose to leave Alberta in the G7 meetings to go back to Washington the day before he's supposed to meet with Sheinbaum. But as it turns out, other cabinet members in the United States basically scolded Sheinbaum for saying, look, of the 10 things we've asked Mexico to fix, including firing some of your cabinet members who we don't agree with, who we know are not going to make the reforms that your country needs and we want you to make. They're basically, the Americans are trying to force Sheinbaum to get rid of the sort of AMLO dinosaurs in the cabinet and move away from the policies of AMLO. And that's a very challenging thing for her to do. She hasn't made movement on that, and the Americans are really pissed off. And so there was, when her office called to reschedule, they said, no, we're not rescheduling with you until you fix that. So this is not a rosy relationship. I don't foresee the worst being over yet. We're still in for some friction. And either the renewal negotiating of the existing USMCA or a negotiation of a new agreement begins in August of this year. So we're not starting on good footing there. And so we don't see any rosy sort of investment picture returning to Mexico this year at all. The other extreme is Argentina. Milei is a very interesting government. I've met a couple of his and I was supremely impressed by their technocratic credentials, their pragmatism, their worldliness. This is a guy who is very much he's a libertarian, but he's also a populist. He understands how to speak to that bottom 40 or 50% of the population who through this economic transition are hurt and hit the most. And he knows how to keep them at bay. He knows how to keep them off the streets. He knows how to keep them ignoring the wishes of their union leaders to go out and protest. And that's important. And that's the difference between him and Macri, the last center-right politician to govern Argentina. Because the rest of the people in his government, the majority of the cabinet, are very much of the same ilk that Macri's sort of Superman team was. These are very capable people. They're doing the hard work. They've essentially fixed 80% of the things that need fixing from a macroeconomic point of view. What remains to be seen is if investment dollars will return to Argentina, starting with Argentines themselves, but also foreign investors, that the portfolio investments that come out of hedge funds, out of pension funds, et cetera, around the world will bolster the peso, in spite of the fact that a lot of Argentines are nervous about holding pesos and would prefer to buy dollars. There's still some question marks there, but everything is pointing positively in Argentina. And in Argentina's success is going to impact the policy frameworks of the next government in Chile, the next government in Colombia, and could possibly also change the narrative in Brasilia, not so much of the Lula administration, but more at the congressional level. So the success of a libertarian, the first libertarian government in Latin America's history, could have profound effects around the region. In Brazil, you have a really mixed bag of sort of emotions and investment climate leanings. On the one hand, there is general discontent with Lula's administration. Thankfully, his party is weak, but the government has, since he's been in government, the spending has continued. It seems like the brakes on Central have come off, and so we're back to pork barrel politics, and that has really hurt the fiscal outlook. But at the other side, for strategic investors, there's heaps of opportunities in Brazil. There's still concessions open for infrastructure. There's still lots of opportunities in both conventional and renewable energy investment. There's this massive new wave of investment from the Chinese to increase export capacity. So it's a mixed bag, but lots of opportunity in Brazil. And if we look forward over the next 2 years and say, where will it measured in dollars, and this is important. So this is a different number than you'll see when you look at real economic growth. This is nominal US dollar denominated growth. So it's factoring in both real growth and the movement in currency values. And where you're seeing where will Latin America grow in terms of add dollar value to its economy, Argentina and Brazil dominate. And that's a real turnaround. For years, the last 15 years, Mexico's been the number one source of growth. So for multinationals looking at the region, this is a very interesting graph. Okay, I'm going to pause there and switch gears quite a bit. And I want to look forward over the next, say, 5 to 10 years. Where are some of the big growth stories? And this is not at a country-to-country level, but rather an industry level. So first of all, Latin America is the fastest aging population in the world. It's not the oldest. That would be Russia, Japan, parts of Eastern Europe, Italy, China, Korea, but it's the fastest aging. They've gone from 5 kids per female to 2 kids per female in 35 years, whereas it took the US 70 years. So that's dramatic, especially for a region that doesn't necessarily receive a lot of immigrants. There are some interesting immigration patterns within the region, but the region as a whole doesn't receive many. So you're seeing rapidly aging populations. When you break it down by age range, it gets really interesting. You see the population of children under 10 years old shrinking by 7 million over the next 10 years alone, while people over 70 will grow by close to 20 million. So Procter & Gamble, that makes diapers and has a big factory in Mexico City, 5 different lines making diapers, already 2 of those lines have been changed from baby diapers to elderly diapers. So these are the kinds of shifts in consumption habits that we're seeing across Latin America on a very fast, and it's opening up wonderful opportunities. It's also closing down opportunities. E-commerce continues to grow in Latin America. It went up in the United States during COVID and then came back down. Why? Because if you look on the right there, the traditional penetration of retail, brick and mortar retail, is much, much higher on a per capita basis than the rest of the world. And so the rest of the world, if you want to buy a set of golf clubs, a book, a certain woman's clothing garment, you're not going to find it in your second tier or third tier. You're going to either have to drive to the big city or order it online. And we're seeing a lot of people ordering more and more online. COVID forced them online, and they've stayed online. We're seeing service sector disruption. I won't even try to navigate this slide. It's too busy. But needless to say, the Latin America's trade agreements starting in the 90s hugely disrupted the manufacturing and agriculture sectors, but did nothing to change the incredibly inefficient and poorly executed service economies in Latin America. It was the cell phone, the smartphone, and the apps and the businesses that are hidden behind those apps that have really changed the services sector in Latin America. And that will continue to be a huge source of growth. We do have some very interesting unicorns in Latin America, these startups that are now worth over $1 billion, but they're actually really small as a percentage of the GDP when you compare to India and China, and much less so than the US. So there's a lot of room for homegrown unicorns to be emerging over the next few years. AI spending will grow at about 20% a year for the next 5 years. There's certain sectors that absorb it more quickly than others: banking, fintech, payments, e-commerce, retail, logistics. So it's operations that you don't see. It's planning and it's diagnostics. And you're seeing that AI is taking hold certainly faster than a lot of people would presume. With AI comes the need for data centers. So most data centers in Latin America up till 5 years ago were actually found in Northern Virginia. But AI forces our computers to do literally 100 times the level of computation around a question than, say, just a Google search. And so as a result, proximity to that data becomes much more important. So we've already seen data centers ballooning across the biggest cities in Latin America, the Sao Paulos, the Santiago, the Buenos Aires, the Bogotas, Mexico City, et cetera. Now we're seeing them spotting up in second-tier cities: Guadalajara, Querétaro, Medellin, Rio, Campinas, et cetera. And this is an interesting area of growth, also around 20% a year. That, combined with the electrification of the region, You're seeing data demand growing at 30% a year. Every time we bring on more 5G, more capacity, it's eaten up. Energy transition. So energy transition is no longer just about cleaning the environment. It's about adding energy capacity. And right now, the story is whether you're Brazil or Argentina or Peru or Colombia, it's any and all sources of electricity are welcome. I mean, the Brazilians are looking at nuclear. Of course, they're looking at traditional, conventional. The Argentines are developing Vaca Muerta and building gas ducts to build more gas powered. But also the Brazilians and the Chileans are really moving very quickly on solar and on wind and on energy storage, which is crucial to that, to renewables. So there is energy demand, which used to grow at about 2% a year, is going to be growing at 5% a year going forward. Huge growth opportunities. And of course, critical minerals. Critical minerals are very much in the news right now as the US and China are in negotiations, and the Chinese very much have the upper hand when it comes to critical metals because they do most of the smelting of these products. But Latin America has tremendous assets, and we may very well see the Argentines and the Chileans in the years ahead demanding that not only you invest in their country and extract their ores, but you process there, you smelt there, you build battery plants there. This is a great opportunity for vertical integration of the metals industry in South America. Here I've mapped out between consumers, industry, and extractive sectors. The ones on the right are the ones that we believe will be the highest growth, and the ones on the left are either low growth or negative growth, based upon some of the trends that I just walked you all through. As I think was noted at the beginning, this is all available. We'll be sharing this recording, and I'm happy to share this deck as well with any of you. So with that, I thank you for your time and welcome any questions.
David, I have a question. Actually, two questions. One, I thought I saw on one of the slides, and I forget which slide number it was. There was a little title or a caption, leaving Latin America in exchange for Taiwan. Could you go back to that slide or expand on that a little bit? I thought I saw that in one of the slides.
Yes, sure. Let me bring that up again. So in that first wave of Chinese investment patterns, are you guys seeing the slides on the screen?
Yeah, we can see them.
Okay. So in that first wave of Chinese investment, I focused on acquiring natural resource assets, but there was also the desire to buy diplomatic credentials. So even though the Americans, with Nixon's visits to China in 72, officially recognized China, the mainland China is the only China, lots of countries around the world continue to recognize Taiwan. And about half of those countries were in the Western Hemisphere. And so China has essentially gifted things like infrastructure to these very small countries, a lot of them in the Caribbean, in return for switching their official diplomatic recognition of China as the PRC and no longer Taiwan.
Okay. And I guess the other question, I'm very fascinated with I guess not to get into politics too much because you're not supposed to talk about it, but Claudia Sheinbaum, the impression I have from media that I see or reading things on the internet is that she's extremely popular in Mexico. You're in Mexico City right now. I think one of the things that makes her very popular is that her statement, at least to her constituents, is that we will not surrender our sovereignty to the United States. We will respect ourselves as a country. We will negotiate peacefully and respectfully, but sovereignty is not on the table. So I found your comment extremely interesting, where I think you said something to the fact that the Trump administration is trying to somehow influence her cabinet. And the impression, I really would just be curious, and again, not with politics is a slippery slope, but I'm really curious what the Mexican people think about her, because the impression I have is that I thought I remember reading somewhere, and I don't know whether it's true or accurate, that she has a very high approval rating.
That is true. She does have a high approval rating, and I think it's a function of two things. First of all, it's inherited legacy of AMLO. AMLO changed the political communications of the presidency dramatically in Mexico. His predecessor, Peña Nieto, who, some technocrats still sort of applaud for the certain changes he did, including the energy reforms, but he was absolutely awful at retail politics. He would go months without a press conference. He was rarely seen in public. He was seen as aloof. He was seen as arrogant. And AMLO was just the opposite. AMLO was folksy. AMLO was down to earth. AMLO was a lot more sophisticated than people realized, but he put on this very much man of the people. He had his daily press conference every morning. And so it was a very contrasting style, and she was chosen by him. So she was seen as a disciple of his brand of politics and has essentially kept in place, almost all of his policies. In fact, has moved further along with his wishes and his urging. Now, that makes her very popular. Oh, and the other thing is that at first, when Trudeau was still prime minister in Canada, the contrast between how the Canadians reacted to Trump versus the Mexicans was quite stark. Canadians, and I speak as a Canadian, are not used to being insulted on the world stage. They're usually the Boy Scouts on the world stage. And so to be sort of continuously insulted, referred to as the 51st state, et cetera, the way that Canada reacted, not just the Canadian people, but the political class, was really emotionally sort of, unintelligent. It was immature. And the Mexicans, by contrast, and I say this as someone who lived in Mexico for many years, American insults, they just run off their back. They've been insulted by the Americans for 150 years. So to hear Trump go on and call Mexicans rapists and this and that, call their, organized crime, a bunch of organized criminals, et cetera, that doesn't faze them. And so the way that she was unfazed in her talks with him, even while he was insulting Mexico, was very admirable, and I think gained a lot of respect of Mexican voters. Now, the Mexican investor class, and the conference I spoke to yesterday was very much a sort of an elite event. They are extremely concerned. They don't necessarily have any misgivings with her as a person. They respect her intelligence, but they're very concerned about AMLO's continued grip on politics, on the Morena party, and on the policy framework of the party. They're very concerned with the judicial elections, which happened a little over a week ago and are really, really troubling in terms of the quality of judges that were elected and the money and interest behind their election. To the point where, I'll just give you an anecdote. A friend of mine, his parents' house hasn't been really used other than sort of a maintenance person for about 3 years since they passed away. And he wants to sell the house. So he's put, a sales sign on the house, and the CFE, which is the electricity monopoly, has told him that they're going to shut down his electricity unless he pays the outstanding bill. And so he asked, how much is the outstanding bill? Well, the outstanding bill, according to them, is 3 million pesos, which is $150,000, which his normal electricity bill, you'd have to, run the house for about 300 years to get that kind of a bill. How do you take on the CFE when the courts are incredibly politicized? So when you take on the government in court, you're not going to win anymore. And so this is a real concern that the extortionary sort of instincts of a lot of corrupt government officials will now take away the one thing that got in their way. When people with some money could fight them in the courts, that's now taken away. And so the moneyed class in Mexico is incredibly concerned, again, not about Sheinbaum the person, but about Morena the party and the continued policy direction that AMLO began.
Thank you very much. I think, John, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I do. John, you mentioned a little bit one subject that obsesses me, and that is demographics. But there's more to that, right? I mean, that's if we kept, sort of things the way they are right now, Brazil doesn't look so bad. But they're at their peak of their demographic boom, and they have a 4% of GDP Social Security deficit. The other countries, Argentina, I don't really know where they are on their pension system because they've gone sort of back and forth on it. But the other countries like Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico have all done a reform to go to fully funded pensions, sort of like Canada. And we have a little bit of a problem here as well. So it seems to me that the performance, especially on the fiscal side of those countries, especially Brazil, is going to deteriorate. And I don't know, it's big, okay? Brazil's big, and they've always relied on that. Then we have the demographics of China. And China should just be a big version of Japan, but it's not. First, they're aging faster than anything we've ever seen, right? And second, I don't think the quality of their investments were anywhere near as good as Japan. So I think, maybe I'll let you just comment on it, but I think China's already starting to hit a tsunami. And I think the countries in Latin America that haven't taken care of something quite simple, and I would include the United States. The United States is nowhere near as bad, but it's still pretty bad on the Social Security front.
No, I agree. Look, I mean, at least the U.S. has immigration. Maybe they're against immigration officially right now, but generally speaking, they have the ability to attract immigrants if the regulations permit them to, and a strong desire from anywhere else in the world to move to the United States. And that's going to be huge. I mean, the whole immigration argument right now is in, I think, the last legs of a sort of nativist element. I'm pretty sure that 20 years from now, countries around the world are going to be fighting for immigrants, because we spent, there was a period of time, whether it was in Japan from the 70s to the end of the century, the United States from the 80s till the sort of 2005, 6, China a little bit later, where you had the maximum percentage of your population working age. Those were the years when you should have been running your largest fiscal surpluses in the entire history of your nation. These were the boom years. This is when you had fewer kids and still not large elderly populations. But we didn't. We ran fiscal deficits. And our ability to turn around deficits and run surpluses is going to get increasingly difficult because of our population structures, and especially those countries that do not have a history of attracting immigrants, like China, like Brazil, at least in the last 40 years. And so, yeah, this is a genuine concern around the globe. Latin America, a little bit more latently than I would say Europe or Eastern Asia. I have a problem everywhere. I do not. I mean, I tell my kids all the time, you better get smart on money right now, because you're going to be you're going to be taxed for the rest of your lives.
The real laggard is Africa, right? And that's a tragedy, but they're starting to they're the youngest countries in terms of dependency ratios. But I would add one thing that the United States has that these other countries don't have: an amazing financial system. So our net worth through all these little, everyone's saying we have too low a savings rate, just keeps going up. And It's not only, so we don't have to save as much because we can invest better. But certainly I don't think China, especially domestically, they have a lot of, white elephants, I would have to say. I don't think they invest. We had a discussion on this before. I don't think their investments in Latin America are the highest quality either. They could be, they could be bringing training and things like that. So let me stop there and get your reaction on that, and then I'll be quiet.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, if you look at the combination of two things, one, how robust, how healthy, how well managed are their pension systems, and then how well have they managed the combination of public and private healthcare. I would say, Chile is sort of at the top of the list, and it sort of comes down from there. And certain countries, I think Brazil has a pretty good health sector, but I worry about its fiscal future. I mean, there's a lot of fat that can be cut on the fiscal side, as you know, but I don't know if the political will's there yet. This is why I'm excited about Milei, because I think Milei really, a lot of the things that were considered sacred in most political circles in Latin America, he's debunked as being sacred. And that will provide political courage to others in other countries to do the same.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
John, it's Adrian. Just a quick
Sure.
one. And thank you for sharing this. It's been very informative. On the I think it was dollar notional growth, you showed Argentina being number one. Looked like Brazil was quite a close second. Can you just elaborate what assumptions and I guess what risks for Argentina are there for that not to happen? Because that sort of, I know they may be coming from a low base, but at the same time, it's tremendous to see them competing with Brazil on sort of equal terms in dollars.
Right. So just in this over the same 2-year period, they're calling for in dollars a 26% increase in the size of the economy. Roughly 17% of that will come from FX, and 8% of it will come from, or maybe 9% of it will come from real GDP growth. So why is the currency going to strengthen? The currency strengthens, and again, so far it's theoretical, but it's holding up. Now we're into 6 weeks of removal of most currency controls, because so much institutional investment money, pension funds, hedge funds, et cetera, who by their own governance rules were not allowed to invest in Argentine assets because of the currency controls, now feel that they can. And Argentina is one of the larger emerging markets that is literally not on their portfolio. So the degree to which they manage emerging market financial assets, they went from 0 on their balance sheets to something closer to a proportionate amount as to the size of the Argentine economy. So that influx of dollars into a pretty narrow capital market has an inflationary impact on the currency, or an appreciative impact on the currency. Buenos Aires, anyone who's been there in the last 3 months knows it's becoming expensive again, and that's going to continue, I think, for at least 1 or 2 years. So that's really what's behind that. Now, could it all go wrong? Yes. Milei does not have. He commands a very small political party, much like Lula in Brazil, and he relies upon the sort of mutual fear of the Peronists to continue corralling support from different parties for his actions. Argentina is also a federalist system, so a great deal of the spending that goes on, as well as the taxation that goes on, is at the provincial level, not necessarily the federal level. But there's generally been alignment between those provincial governors and Milei's party. Now, how will that political support hold, or what could diminish it? Well, what would diminish it is if the working class turned against Milei, like they did against Macri. And so that's where his populist instincts are so important of maintaining, because if he loses the street, then those political allies will run scattering like mice, and the whole thing falls apart. So it's really important that the working class continue to support Milei's experiment.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, this is David. This is a really great. Just want to do a time check. We're at 6:15. I don't know if anyone has any final questions, or if not, I guess we could leave you, John, with closing remarks.
Oh, just to say, someone once pointed out to me when I was in London, giving a presentation on Latin America. They said, when you're looking at Latin America from this far away, it looks amazing. It's a region steeped in natural resource assets, a huge middle class, and still healthy demographics. Generally pro-free trade and pro-business policies. When you get closer, you see the corruption, you see the bureaucracy, you see the crime, and you get very concerned. And then when you're up really close and you're talking to people one-on-one, you realize just the incredible quality of people running these countries. And I say that both, not so much in government, but in the private sector, their capabilities, their work ethic, their professionalism, and that faith and optimism return. So you have to look at this region, as CFOs. It's not always easy to convince your board to take a chance on emerging markets, and you really have to very carefully build your business cases by not just the sort of macro, data points, but studying the successes of companies in your industries and how they did it, what they did differently versus how they operate, say, in Europe or the US, and using those case studies to really make a convincing argument to invest in the region.